member of the Palmer Toastmasters Club in Palmer, Alaska. This speech is working on the Pathways Level 3 elective project, Connect with Storytelling. The speech time will be 13 to 15 minutes. The storytelling has been a form of communication throughout the history of mankind. Storytellers have served many purposes throughout the centuries. They have been tellers of news, upholders of religion and morals, entertainers and carriers of culture. A story can be humorous or dramatic, but it should always be entertaining. It should capture the listener's interest and carry them along. Vicki's objective with this project are: 1, to tell a story about a personal experience, giving it color and life through the use of vivid description and expressive dialogue, and 2, to create images in such a way that everyone can see, hear, feel, smell, and taste the scenes described. A 6th-generation lifelong Alaskan of Alutiiq and Norwegian descent, Vicki was born and raised in the island of Kodiak, Alaska, just as her mother and many generations of women in her mother's lineage. She was 7 years old when the Great Alaska Earthquake happened. Like so many survivors of any traumatic event, Vicki does not often speak of that day and the weeks that followed. The story you are about to hear is a true, unembellished account from the eyes of a 7-year-old girl who was thrown into the reality of the raw, naked, unbalanced war between man and Mother Nature, and provides a glimpse of a few of the many unsolved mysteries experienced by those who survived. Please help me welcome Vicki Randolph with her story entitled The Good Friday Phone Call. Please welcome Vicki.
It was a mild, pleasant, late afternoon in March on Kodiak Island that day. There was very little snow on the ground. The temp was about 40 degrees. The skies were clear. There was no wind, and the ocean was calm. My mother was in the kitchen preparing spaghetti and meatballs for dinner. My baby brother Johnny was 2 years old and was sitting in his high chair playing with spaghetti noodles. My older brother Brett was 9 and was laying on the floor watching cartoons. My father had just arrived home from work a few minutes earlier. I had worn a blue plaid skirt and a white blouse to school that day, and I was still wearing my school clothes when my father arrived home. I hoped he would notice me and comment how nice I looked. I was 7 years old. And I was excited because it was Easter weekend and we would be coloring Easter eggs the next day. That day was Good Friday, March 27th, 1964. We had just sat down at the dinner table when the house started to shake. Earthquakes are common in Alaska, and this wasn't the first one I'd experienced. We waited for the shaking to stop. This time, though, the shaking did not stop. In fact, it got worse. Much, much worse. The table was bouncing around and the dishes were being tossed to the floor. I looked up at the pendulum light hanging above the table and it was swinging wildly back and forth. I looked out the window and saw the trees whipping around, which was really weird because there was no wind. The water in my guppy bowl was sloshing out and spilling all over the floor. My father yelled for us to get under the tables and to stay away from the windows. Mom grabbed my baby brother and she, my father, and my older brother crowded under the dining room table. I tried to stand up, but I was thrown to the floor. I crawled on my hands and knees towards the coffee table. And about that time, the guppy bowl slid off and fell to the floor in front of me, but fortunately it didn't break. There was still some water left in the bowl, so I stopped to scoop up the guppies from the floor and put them back in the bowl. And my mom yelled at me, "Vicki, leave the guppies!" There was this deafening roar around us. It sounded like an overloaded freight train running through our living room. Now, I know now that that's the sound of an earthquake. The noise, the things banging on the walls and in cupboards, things crashing to the floor, the sound of a wood frame house popping and groaning as it twists and was contorted. But mostly it was the sounds of the violent movement of the earth, and it's a sound that still haunts me to this day. It seemed as though the earthquake lasted forever. When the shaking finally stopped, everything was suddenly eerily quiet. The power was out. My father checked the phone and the line was dead. Now, he worked as the lead foreman on the power generation plant on the Navy base, and he always responded when the power went out. So he immediately left the house to go back to work. It was about 45 minutes to an hour that passed from the time that my father left the house. And by this time it was starting to get dusk, and without any heat in the house was getting cold. The aftershocks were nearly continuous. My mom had cleaned up the mess lit a candle. She was sitting in the chair with my baby brother on her lap, smoking cigarettes and waiting for my father to come home. We had not eaten, and my brother and I were still wearing our school clothes. Our old dog Patches was nowhere to be found. I fed my guppies and I added some water to their bowl. And then the phone rang. It only rang one time, which was odd because we already knew the phone line was dead. And even the ring sounded odd. We all stared at the phone, and then Mom finally picked up the receiver and put it to her ear. And she listened without saying anything, and then hung up the phone and told us we had to get out of the house right away because a tidal wave was coming. Well, I was only 7 years old, and I didn't know what a tidal wave was, but I was old enough to know that my mother was very afraid. My brother and I grabbed our winter coats. Mom grabbed my baby brother and a blanket and a flashlight, and within minutes out the door we went. It was dusk, but still light enough to see the trail. We followed Mom up the trail behind our house, deep into the woods into the higher ground. We finally sat down under a large, gnarly spruce tree. Well, as a young girl, I spent most of my free time exploring those woods, and this particular tree was one I had climbed often, and I knew it very well. I leaned into it, and it felt like an old friend. By this time, it was dark, and the sense of the woods, the birds singing, the full moon filtering through the canopy above us, kind of gave all of us a false sense of calmness. It was about now that my mother realized she had grabbed a baby bottle instead of the flashlight, and she started chain smoking, one cigarette after another. We all sat there in the dark, silent and cold. And we waited, but I didn't know what we were waiting for. And then I realized that the birds had stopped singing. Well, growing up on Kodiak and in my native culture, I was taught to listen and to respect the earth. And even at the age of 7, I was aware of the sounds of nature around me. Many of the ocean buoys around Kodiak Island had a very distinct sound or whistle. So growing up there, I could often tell which buoy was singing its song to the current. Well, that night, I first heard Buoy 4, which sits way out off the eastern end of Kodiak Island and marks 2 strong, deep cross currents. Buoy 4 was clanging louder and more wildly than I'd ever heard it in the worst of storms. And then we started to hear all the buoys clanging wildly. That noise was accompanied with something I can't really describe. It sounded and the air felt like a surge of something super intense and powerful, this massive force of energy. Well, this pattern of silence, followed by the noise of the buoys and that energy surge, happened 3 times over the next several hours. I know now those patterns were the 3 largest tsunami waves that hit Kodiak Island that night. And finally, after a long period of silence, the birds started to sing again. Mom stood up and she said, "Let's go home." We walked slowly through the woods back to the house, and thankfully the old house was still there. My father wasn't there, and he did not come home that night. The next day was Saturday. The news coming across the shortwave radio was mostly about how badly Hilo, Carson City, and Anchorage had been hit by the earthquake and multiple tsunami waves. We didn't yet know what had happened to Kodiak, or at least my mother wasn't saying. From our home, we could see the ocean and lots of debris and overturned boats floating by in the current. A family member stopped in to check on us and told us that our grandmother's home and one aunt's home were destroyed. 2 of my uncles were missing, and we still had no word from my father. Sunday was Easter. There were no Easter eggs, no Easter baskets, no church bells ringing, no choir singing. It was another day riddled with near continuous, very strong aftershocks. Each one seemed to eat away at the frayed edges of what little bit of sanity we had left. We learned from the shortwave radio that Kodiak had been hit hard with at least 3 huge tidal waves of between 35 and 45 feet in height. We had a series of very strong aftershocks that day, and later that afternoon, my cousin drove into the driveway and burst through the front door of our home. He had our grandmother, another aunt, and several cousins in his truck, And he said we had to get to higher ground immediately because a 90-foot tidal wave was coming. The fear I had heard in my mom's voice was nothing compared to the fear I saw in my grandmother's face that afternoon. Mom and one of her sisters sat in the front of the truck with my cousin, both of them clutching their babies, neither one knowing if their husbands were alive or dead. We made our way through back roads and debris and up Pillar Mountain. Most of the town was already up there, and we all sat silent, afraid to talk, watching the oceans. The town lay in ruins below us. I could see my grandmother's log home torn from its foundation and broken apart. We saw the hulls of dozens of boats and tons of rubble floating in what used to be the boat harbor and the channel. The shoreline and downtown were destroyed. The canneries and most buildings along the waterfront were gone or damaged beyond recognition. Every shoreline road was washed out. There was total devastation spread before us, and the earth continued to shake. Mom asked around, but no one knew anything of the fate of the men from the power plant on the base. After several hours of sitting and watching the ocean and expecting our world to end, my mother snapped. She stood up and she said, "I need a cigarette." And she turned and she started to walk down the mountain, leaving me and my brothers behind. There was a tsunami wave that afternoon, but it was small in comparison to what had already hit Kodiak. And we went to bed that Easter night, not knowing if my father was alive. It was the early hours of Monday morning that I heard strange voices. And then I recognized my father's voice. Mom tried to stop me from seeing him, but it pushed past her. My father and two other men were standing at our back porch, each of them covered with a black, smelly, oily residue slick up to their necks. It was quite some time before my father talked about what had happened to him. The family car had died at the top of the hill just inside the security gate to the base when my father was responding to the big quake. He had run the extra 2 miles to the power plant on foot. And when he went back to the car several days later with a friend to try to tow it, the car started right up. Had he been able to drive the car all the way to the power plant, it would have been washed away with the tsunami waves. Inside the power plant, he and the two men were trapped when the tsunamis hit. And they were alive only because they were able to climb on top of equipment and were able to hold on while the tsunami waves filled that room again and again. The Great Alaska Earthquake was the largest in North America and the second largest earthquake in recorded history. It measured 9.2 on the Richter scale, and it lasted 4 minutes and 38 seconds. The earthquake was felt as far away as Florida and Texas. Over 100,000 square miles of land in Alaska were impacted, some liquefying, some sinking, and some jutted upward as much as 38 feet. Parts of Kodiak Island sank by 8 feet, and other parts rose by 30 feet. 131 people in Alaska, Oregon, and California died as a result of the earthquake and the tsunamis. 5 of those people were my great-uncle Soot Larson and his fishing boat crew of 4 when their fishing boat was slammed into the cliff. Over 20 tsunami waves were generated and measured all over the earth, with the largest wave measuring 220 feet in Shoup Bay, Alaska. My guppies survived. Our old dog Patches came back. It was years before we had spaghetti and meatballs for dinner again, and never on March 27th or around Easter time. It was some time before Mom would talk about that phone call. It had come from my father. He told Mom to get us out of the house and to higher ground because tidal waves were coming. Now, our phone line in 1964 was a party line always full of static and other people on the line. And when my father would call from the power plant, there was always a lot of background noise, no matter what room he called from, or even if the power was out. Mom remembered that there was total silence on the phone other than his voice that night. She later questioned the other families who shared our party line, but no one had heard the phone ring. My parents were not wealthy, and they had recently encountered a great deal of medical expense for multiple surgeries on my baby brother. They would not have been able to buy another car had ours been lost to the tidal wave. My father and his crew were trapped in an area of the power plant where they could climb on top of equipment and hold on as the big waves surged into and out of the building 3 times. My father was not a religious man, but perhaps that night he said a prayer. While no one who survives a catastrophic event is left unharmed, the loss of life in the 1964 earthquake and tsunamis was minimal considering the magnitude of destruction. We did lose my great uncle Soot and his crew. A memorial was erected, and it shows behind me, and 5 roads were named for them near the cape where Mother Nature claimed their lives. Another of my uncles had been reported missing, but he turned up uninjured. Our family car broke down on high ground, yet started right up several days later. My father and 2 men from his crew miraculously survived being trapped in a building with toxic water up to their necks. So many unsolved mysteries for my family and so many others. I do believe in divine intervention, and I know God was definitely the switchboard operator for that Good Friday phone call. Mr. Toastmaster.
Game over.